Now I'd like to turn our attention, as you notice on our sheet today, we are going to discuss safety and security in our schools, and I'd like to turn this over to Mr. Salters. He's going to start it. There's a number of people who are going to speak to you this evening. That's why you note we have administrative team on the agenda. So Mr. Salters is going to start it and then kick it off to Mr. Ellsworth.
Thank you, Dr. Little. Members of the board, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this evening around the topic of safety and security in our schools. I understand, obviously this has been much conversation in the last few weeks, and I want to tell you this evening that we're going to give you a nice overview of where we are and what we do and how we operate. But I'll kind of preface the whole conversation with we aren't going to get very specific in a public meeting. And the reason we don't do that is because we don't want to give anyone doing harm to our students or staff a blueprint on how to do it. And I hope you can appreciate and understand that. And so this evening I'm going to give you, good opportunity to get an overview, and then we'll be happy to answer questions that you may have. In some cases, we may direct those questions to an offline conversation as it's appropriate. This evening, I'm going to introduce Mr. Chris Ellsworth. Mr. Ellsworth has been in the district now a number of years, came in 2014. Prior to that, he was in law enforcement with the town of Lexington, served a number of roles there. He was an SRO at Lexington Middle School for a number of years. Was on the SWAT team, Internet Crimes Task Force, detective there, so he's got a broad law enforcement background. Chris is also trained as a standard response protocol instructor, standard reunification methodology instructor. He's also a School Shield security site assessment certified individual, so he can do site assessments for safety and certified nationally on that. So we're very fortunate to have his skill set. We also have Sean Spivey on our team with similar background and training. Chris served as the chairman of the SCASA Roundtable, the School Administrator Association Roundtable for Safety and Security. Through that roundtable, we share a lot of knowledge with individuals across the state and end up giving a lot of guidance and suggestion for folks and how we do things through the expertise that we have on staff. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris and we'll get started.
Thank you, Mr. Salters. Good evening. I hope I got this working right. Let's test this really quick. Yeah, here we go. So going to give a brief overview of our safety and security in our schools. Currently, we update our EBCB policy. That happened pretty recent to conform with the new law 5963-910 related to cycle line and our safety security drills. I'll go into in-depth a little bit about that. What that looks like for us. What we have to do by law is 2 lockouts, 2 lockdowns at a minimum, 2 earth or weather drills. We set that to 1 tornado and 1 earthquake. Ask them to do it 1 per semester at a minimum. We still do our monthly fire drills. The law is it's written a little different, but we went ahead and did the 10 fire drills. I think some argue that no, you don't have to do that anymore with the new law, but we continue to do that monthly. We also train our staff to active shooter training twice per year, as the guidelines are written by SLED, that we train that twice per year. COVID has changed that a little bit because now we do it virtually currently this year. So it used to be we'd go around and be in front of the schools, like you can see in this picture, training all the staff. We conform our emergency protocols to the national standard of the SRP, which is through the I Love You Guys Foundation. You can find all this online. This is very public information, okay? SRP, what that means is what you see here. These are some of our protocols that we utilize, and the reason we do that, when I started here in 2014 and started looking at our schools and evaluating them and what we did for, say, a lockdown, one school may say, hey, Miss Susie's cooking cookies in the lunchroom right now, and that meant lockdown. And then another school may have said, lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. Well, what we needed was a unified response, a unified communication for everybody. Standard Response Protocol brought that. Go out, research that, look up the I Love You Guys Foundation. It's an amazing story how that came to be. I don't have the time to talk through that here. But if I'm a substitute going to Oak Grove Elementary in the morning and then going out to Pillion Elementary the next morning, we all do the same communication on the overhead speaker, so we all know what's going on. Our active shooter training, we conform to this national standard, which is a CRAZE training, civilian response to active shooter events. I'm a certified instructor in that, have been since, it was back in my law enforcement days when I started with that, so I'd have to get you a date. But we work with SLED. SLED brings this to our administration, brings it to law enforcement. They host classes for us. We go in and get certified so that we can teach active shooter training, right? So this teaches us about, I can't get into too much detail, but you can see there the stress response the body's gonna have. We go through the, what the teacher or the administrator or the staff member should be doing in the event of a lockdown or active shooter event, step by step. Couple of questions, at least one question I get pretty often, which is needs to be communicated here, is why don't we use these type of barricade devices in South Carolina? Why can't I use this in my classroom? I have that question often. And the reason is it's against fire code. We cannot put a secondary device on those doors. And that's not Chris Ellisor, that's not Lexington One, that's South Carolina fire code that says we cannot do that. Our monthly fire and safety inspections, so we started this as a part of the State Fire Marshal's Office, passed this past year. It hasn't gone into full effect at the Department of Ed yet. They will put this online and make it available to us. I think we are bound by the law starting next year to make sure all this is done. They kind of gave us a waiver due to COVID. But we are already doing this in our schools. We started this in August, and this is a checklist of about, I think it's 41 items that each school must do monthly on a fire and safety inspection put out by the South Carolina Fire Marshal's Office. Threat assessments, that is also new to the district. This came out and I want to say it was written in 2019 through the Department of Ed and I think 31 committee members at the state level. The purpose, the goal is to distinguish between the student that's making a threat, are they truly posing the threat? Are they just saying this, or is there truly a threat here? So the background, if a threat assessment occurs in our schools, it involves at least 3 people. It involves an administrator, a trained administrator, an SRO, and a counselor or psychologist. And so those 3 people are the minimum for that initial screening. They sit down, they answer these questions together, they evaluate it, and they make a determination as to whether or not it needs to advance to a full threat assessment. This, again, is new to our district. We are currently holding trainings. We've held 2 currently this year. We held 2 last year. We've got 4 more coming in January, February for our staff. This is a whole new task for my department. So we are managing it. We work with Dr. Melissa Reeves, who is actually the author for the state of South Carolina's program to train our staff currently. You will see this around the schools. This is our poster. This is for an anonymous tip line that we have here in Lexington One. We started this about 3 or 4 years ago. We always had a tip. We always had a tip line in the meaning of picking up a phone, dialing a number, leaving a message. This allowed us to take it to a different level where our students can send a text. That is how they communicate, right? I mean, students are communicating via that cell phone and that text messaging. We have currently, this is where we're at as far as our calls of service related to our tip line. 43% of those are after school. Note that 43% of those are coming to our department after school hours. There are 4 of us that monitor our emails after hours. After we go home, we take a look at our emails to make sure that no one has submitted a tip. If a tip is submitted, we work closely with our law enforcement agencies to remedy that. I felt it important to take a very proactive approach regarding this. Reactive being if we waited till the next morning. We can't do that anymore. We can't wait for a student to get off the bus that has made a threat the night before via Snapchat, so some social media platform. Maybe they sent a text. But we work one-on-one with law enforcement, myself and my partner. If we get one of these, and we've gotten them up to 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, y'all. This is, I mean, we send officers to the door. We deal with it then. We have the parent bring the student in the next morning to meet with the administration. That's how we've run this program. And I'd say it's working pretty good. I think it's brought a new resource to us. 57% of those are during school hours. Each one of our schools does have a school resource officer. This program has been in place for quite some time. We try to continue to grow that program, and it's working so far. I think it's working fairly well. Our front entrances, you'll notice this as of 2 years ago, we put these devices in where you actually have to push a button and talk to someone before you can just make entry into our schools. Just another layer to help us provide security to our schools. Again, I would back up and just, we work off a locked door system. That's important in our district. So each student, depending on where you're at, they may have an access ID. I have one here. All of us have them. And that's how you get in and out of our schools now. It used to be you just walked in, opened the door, go right in, right? So we're trying to, I'm sorry. Again, this is that's right. I can see you coming into my school and not let you in if chosen to, correct?
Ma'am, I'm
Are we
sorry.
in a, thank you.
Are they supposed to ask for ID? I mean, I'm just wondering if anybody can just press the doorbell and walk on in, because I've never been asked for ID, and I think it's one of your different schools.
Ma'am, if you could, can she email you if you'll email Dr. Little, he'll answer that for you.
Thank you. Student threats, I put this in here just to, make a point more or less, and I hope the parents that are listening to this, Section Code 1617-425 is a new law in South Carolina. It was acted in 2018, but if the student makes a threat, they're going to be prosecuted if it's deemed prosecutable by law enforcement. And so we work one-on-one with our agencies. Please, please, please speak to your students. Make sure they understand the things that they say do have consequences. The choices they make have consequences, whether good or bad. That's really, that's the purpose of this slide. It is unlawful for the student to make those statements. It is a challenge these days with that. So please, please, please speak to your students. Make sure they understand what they say does have an effect. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Tracy Bender.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Board, Mr. Dr. Little. I wanted to briefly bring you up to par about how school counselors' role play into safety and supporting with our schools when we do our process. When we look at this process, it's not just linear or singular. It's very complex, it's multi-layer, it's ongoing, and it can be repetitive. So mental wellness does play an impact in this safety. First thing we did is leadership lessons. At our middle and elementary schools, we have designed lessons that they do, and it's designed, every school does the same lessons, so we're consistent across the district. At our elementary schools, we do academics, careers, social, emotional, and bullying lessons so our students are informed. Now, we spend a great time on bullying because it's often misidentified. To be bullying, there's 4 criteria. 1, it has to be repetitive. 2, it has to intent to harm. 3, there has to be a power imbalance between the victim and the bully. And 4, the bully gains control over the victim. 3 of those must be present in order to declare it bullying. That's important to school counselors because as we do our services, if it is bullying, we don't want to bring the bully and the victim together and try to mediate or peer mediate a conflict resolution because it can further harm the victim, excuse me. When we look at our middle school lessons, we do the same basic thing except we spend time on anxiety and coping skills. We spend more time helping the students deal with that. And lastly, we have our Errands Law Lessons. These are elementary. They're required by the State Department or state law when we get down to it. And they address sexual assaults, making sure our children don't fall victims of sexual perpetrators. We do that 4K through 5th grade. It's progressive lessons. They build on each other. It starts real simple with 4K, which is emotions associated with a color. And then 5th grade actually gets internet safety, dealing with sexual perpetrators. So we build on that as we build with it. Then we provide individual, small group, and crisis counseling. For our school counselors, these are brief solution focus. They last 4 to 8 sessions, 4 to 8 weeks. Because we serve all students and we don't do long-term therapeutic work, we refer out if we can't complete that in that 4 to 8 week cycle. Then we have our mental wellness teams. Our mental wellness teams bring stakeholders in the building together. They get referral from a child. They make sure everybody has that piece of the puzzle and we bring it all together for a big picture. It's like our safety net. Then we collaborate together about coordination of services. What does this child need? What does this student need? How can we best help them? What do we need to do? Is it working? And then we refer out if we need to for other agencies. That does relate to our referral services. We have internal referral services such as our social workers. We use them for referrals. And we have our external with our partners. We're looking at a potential new service with Care Solace. This company will help us look at a parent's insurance and help them get mental health services within 72 hours. So hopefully we may get that in place. We also have numerous agencies that we work with in our community to help us provide services, such as the Courage Center, Midlands Fatherhood Coalition, South Carolina Youth Advocate Programs. We have a lot of agencies we work with and how we help our students and families get those services. School counselors are the hub for mandated reporting. It's required by law, and every year we start with our school counselors doing briefings to their staff about what is required for child abuse. And of course, counselors then serve the role of helping either staff or themselves make those law enforcement or DSS reports when a child is being suspected of abuse. And then we do follow-up afterwards. We have our suicide risk assessments. Again, this is a screening tool. It's not a diagnostic assessment. Anytime a child makes a statement or communicates in any form or fashion, they're going to harm self or kill self, we initiate this process because we'll never take the risk that the child would not do this. Self-reporting is not the most reliable. We initiate that. We gather that information. We always provide it to the parent, and then we provide that parent resources. And depending on what we find out, it directs what we do next. And that in itself, getting the kid to talk to us, is an intervention in itself. We have our collaboration with, we have our social emotional learning check-ins that we're doing in our screener. We do social emotional check-ins in the buildings with counselors, and we also help teachers develop some things they can check in. We actually now have a social emotional check-in that we do right here at Central Services every week with the staff here where they can do a check-in themselves with that. So we implement that as well. And then we also look at our screener. Of course, State Department of Education has mandated all districts have a screener. We're doing that through Terrace Metrics. We're currently finishing up that screener. Once we're done, the school counselors then look at the results and we'll do follow-up and check-ins with those kids and then look at services such as small group, individuals, and referrals and how we can help them. And then we're going to do a deep dive into the data to look for long-term trends and analysis to what we learned. We have our collaboration with our outside agencies. This is our memorandums of understanding. Of course, we have Lexington County Mental Health, where we can guarantee to have a mental health counselor in all of our schools. There's 18 of them assigned to us. We have one in every school. We have Life Changes. They do our intensive family services work when families need help. They do it 24/7, 7 days a week, anytime, weekends and holidays, and they actually come into school more times during the week, 4 or 5 times to help our kids and family. We have Sexual Trauma in the Midlands. They provide that if our child is a victim of sexual abuse. And our newest partner is the Dickerson Center. A lot of people associate them with law enforcement and forensic interviews, but they actually provide free counseling services that are not associated with that. And they also have bilingual counselors, so we're using that as well. And we just started with our pilot program with them, where they're actually sitting on some of our mental wellness teams as an outside agency, hearing and say, okay, have you thought about using this? Have you thought about this? Because we're a school district, we may see things from inside eyes. They help us look at a bigger picture and how we help a child. And then, of course, we have our collaboration with Blue Cross and Blue Shield and USC when we're dealing with our elementary Engaging with Compassion project. And lastly, we have our grief and loss response. We have response teams of counselors and school psychologists that go out to schools when we have a tragedy such as a death of a parent, in some circumstances, the loss of a staff member, or a death of a child. Unfortunately, sadly, we had a crisis response this week, but we deployed a brand new tool that we have never used before. We have one of our school counselors became a certified trainer, and her dog did too, for therapy with grief and loss. So she was able to use her dog and come into the school as a therapy dog with grief and loss, and we were able to use that. It was a huge success. In fact, when students walked in the door and says, upset and crying and says, well, can counselor help you? No, I want to talk to the dog and pet the dog. So it really was a great help when we got to use that services. With our services, we're constantly evaluating and reviewing them, checking to see if we can do improvements, checking if we can make it better, because that's what we have to do, because these things are ongoing, repetitive, overlapping, so always checking. Every month, I participate in the American School Counselor Association National School District Directors Meeting. Every month, we talk about what's going on. I can tell you that every month, across the nation, these issues are being seen everywhere. This is something new that we've never dealt with on the scale that we've dealt with before, at least from the school counselor perspective. So it's not unique to us. But as I listen, I will tell you that what we have in our district and our willingness to always think outside the box and look at it is setting us aside or better than help with our children. It's really a pleasure to have that ability, and I've worked in more than one district. It is a pleasure to have that in our hands and be able to do that. With that, if there are any questions for you, I'd be happy to answer them.
Go ahead, Chris.
I think just regarding feedback on one item you present, the suicide risk assessment. I guess one of our roles up here is to kind of look at things through maybe a little different filter than what's seen on a day-to-day basis. And as a pediatrician, I will oftentimes have a suicide risk assessment come in the office because that clearance can be provided by your medical doctor. I would argue and say that we're probably not the best and most equipped to do that because we run at a volume pace. And so there's always this pressure. I mean, y'all have all been to your doctor's office. You don't want to wait. What you don't know is that sometimes we're sitting there for an hour talking to a child who's ultimately potentially looking at making a very horrible decision in life, and we're trying to convince them that the world is better with them than without them. And I would argue and say there's maybe a better mechanism than that to filter through your primary care physician, just based off the way we're sort of structured.
So to answer that question, in our letter that we provide parents, we don't recommend they go to their pediatrician
Right.
and say, hey, you might get your pediatrician, they might say you have to go somewhere
Sure.
else, but the parent says, well, can I go if I want to? We can't deny that.
Sure.
But I understand exactly what you're saying because we hit that. We do actually allow military chaplains because they're trained in suicide things versus a preacher, so we even have an option with that as well.
Right. And ultimately, we make the recommendations we have to make, and sometimes we have to we do have to seek outside care and outside sources, unfortunately, but just a method of feedback.
But before we start asking questions, Mr. Pender kind of jumped the gun a little bit. There's still, this is like a song that you think's over and everybody starts clapping and then the band keeps playing. We actually have a few more slides left on this presentation, and then let's take questions as a group.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Little. Just briefly, wanted to highlight and remind the board of some commitments that you made over the past few years related to funding of safety and security. So we've already mentioned the Director of Safety Emergency Services was brought on board. We've had SROs in the district well before that and have continued to expand the schools that we've had those at. So, but it got to a point in volume that we needed someone dedicated to supporting these efforts, and that happened in the budget. In 18-19, you'll recall that there was a $4.5 million increase dedicated to safety and security and additional social and emotional measures related to student health, and that millage increase was dedicated for those expenditures. And then in the 2018 referendum, there was some money earmarked to finish up some infrastructure improvements related to safety at our schools across the district as well. Approximately 6.9, close to $7 million over the last 3 fiscal years from the general fund has been committed to safety and security. A big portion of that is our SROs at our schools, and that's through partnerships with our local municipalities. Approximately $2 million additionally has been committed to social emotional measures, including social workers, mental health counselors, and 504 coordinator, Mr. Pender alluded to a little while ago. So, significant investment over the last few years in recurring expenditures related to staffing to support safety and security in our schools. With that being said, you know, we're continuously evaluating additional layers of safety and security. We take, obviously, this very, very seriously. You know, we're, as Mr. Ellisor mentioned, we're sending law enforcement out to homes at 3 o'clock in the morning when we get a tip to make sure a student or a threat is really neutralized or not going to, you know, show up the next morning. So we take this very seriously. But there are always layers of security that we can look at to improve, and we're doing that on a regular basis. With each event that occurs, we have after-action meetings and evaluate our procedures, staff's response. Are there holes in our training efforts that we can improve on? Are there holes in our response, the way we handle a situation? Can we improve on that? So we do those after-action meetings as well. When we're evaluating additional safety measures, we look at a few things at a minimum, but we always want to look at the impact on the learning environment. You know, obviously the effectiveness of whatever measure it is we're looking at. You know, whether it's reactionary or proactive. And you can have both. You know, we can have things that are reactionary, but we all obviously like proactive measures. You know, how scalable it is. It doesn't do me any good to, you know, buy this great piece of technology that I can only put at one door at one facility or one, you know, campus. We want things to be scalable, and then, you know, is it a long-term solution or is it, you know, some kind of temporary solution? So those are things we look at. Mr. Ellisor mentioned several of our agencies before. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention our partnerships that we have with municipalities that serve our schools. You know, Lexington County Sheriff's Department, Town of Lexington Police Department, Town of Pillion Police Department, all have an important role with us. But we also work closely with SLED. And SLED conducts site assessments and evaluates, you know, school safety and your layers of security and looks for areas and ways to improve. And so, you know, we're partnering with them to conduct some of those assessments in the upcoming months, and, you know, we'll consider any recommendations that they have and discuss those with you guys as we move forward. And with that, we would be happy to answer any questions that you guys have at this time. And Dr. Little, if you have anything else you'd like to offer.
I do want to echo the partnership with law enforcement. I'll never forget that Chief Green, in a meeting with the governor, gosh, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago now, talked about that our relationship with local law enforcement was a real model for the state, and that was a great compliment from Chief Green, because we're able to cut through that bureaucracy, red tape kind of stuff, and just move. And it's very agile, flexible, and we go after it, as opposed to, well, we got to do this and do this and do this. Our law enforcement and works so hand in hand with us, and we can't talk about safety without really highlighting that relationship. Just a huge thanks to Sheriff Kuhn and Chief Green and the folks down in Pillion, and about how we work together and continuously. Again, I think that's the other thing that you said that I want to talk about is it's a continuous improvement cycle. Improvement is really about the art of self-reflection, and I think we do that really well and try to stay ahead of things. So any questions, we can certainly talk about that as well.
I have a few questions. So on our school buses, how many of those don't have working cameras?
You'd have to talk to the transportation. I'm not sure. That's Bill Kurtz can answer that question for you. We can get back to you on it.
I don't know the answer to that either, but it's a considerable amount. It's not just a handful. I think all of the newer buses that we've gotten are not yet equipped with cameras. I don't have a figure or a percentage, but I can find that out.
Because I know we do have threats on the school buses.
That's right.
We've had weapons, so I think that's something we need to look at. I also know that when they got new buses, I'm not sure they took the cameras off of the old buses. So that might be something worth looking into. Let's see here. What is the protocol when a weapon is reported on the bus?
On a bus. Depending on the circumstances, I would assume when you say a weapon is reported, are we in transit? Are we getting off the bus? I mean, there are certain steps you may take. Again, circumstantial. Is there a set standard that says, hey, if little Joey says there's a gun on the bus, we stop and lock the bus down? Not necessarily. We may call on the radios and get somebody en route to that bus, most likely, whether it be law enforcement and school administration. It'd be a step-by-step process. It's circumstantial. It depends on what's going on with that.
Okay. So my next question was, what are we doing to ensure that our drivers are aware of these protocols?
Our drivers are trained every year annually on these protocols I just shared with you. And then Mr. Kurtz, you have to speak with him as to the training he puts his drivers through, but I know he works with SLED also to do some training.
Okay. I know you mentioned that we have resource officers in the schools, but each school does not have a full-time SRO. Are we looking into any other options for full-time SROs? Or, I mean, I know I had asked Dr. Little about security guards. There are some districts in the state that, since there is a shortage of resource officers, that they've considered that. Is that something y'all have discussed?
My statement, I guess my remark to that would be that we have school resource officers in each school. As far as any contracted service, I think we discussed that years past maybe in reflection, but not anything substantial.
Okay. So you probably wouldn't know, like, do we have any cameras that aren't working at the schools? Like, do we have any boss tickets waiting on cameras to be fixed?
That would be an IT question. I'm certain there are probably boss tickets, but I would need to defer to Dr. Rivers.
Yes, we do have schools that will turn in a boss ticket when the camera's down, and we do service those. So we ask them to check regularly so that we can kind of keep up with them. We have a technician that goes out and repairs those as quickly as possible.
Okay.
I don't know how many are in there right now, but I can get that information to you.
Okay, thank you. So how many requests, I'm not sure who asked this to, for security items that have not been filled? For instance, or just cameras, I guess around the school, we found out White Knoll High School had some blind spots where they needed cameras, so those are being put up. Are we aware of any other schools that may have blind spots or that may need upgraded camera systems?
I'll say that. So we're in the process of upgrading cameras across the district, and it's a long process because cameras are expensive, and we have a lot of them. And every time we go into a school and do a new camera installation, we evaluate coverage with that new technology and make placements accordingly. So we do have from time to time, schools will make a request, hey, I have this area that I can't see, and I had a situation occur. Can we get a camera there? And so we'll get a camera added. But those come in from time to time, and we respond to them.
Okay. Oh, Mr. Ellisor, you said that the active shooter training was being done virtually because of COVID. Has that affected any of the other drills? Have those been?
So COVID has affected drills, yes. SLED put out some guidance on that, how to perform lockdown drills during that state of COVID. And we adhere to that with them.
Okay. So just say, for instance, lockdown. Has that been, have all students gone through that for the last, I guess, twice a year? Or have they just kind of sat in the classroom and said, this is what we would do?
Again, I think I don't want to get into the details of how we manage a lockdown. However, there was guidance put out by SLED, and we did follow that guidance, correct.
Okay. So have we talked about any programs, or has there been any talk of programs that bring in like dads or moms in the school? Dads on duty, moms on a mission. I'd read about other districts doing things like this to kind of get discipline under control. Because I guess that's the biggest thing that I keep hearing over and over, is that all of this is beginning because there is no discipline in the schools. So I think to even have a conversation about safety and security, we got to start with discipline.
I really don't have a comment to that. I don't handle the discipline side. I can refer to others, but I think there are programs where fathers and things come in, or did come into the schools. I'm not sure where we're at with that with COVID, but yes. I can't remember the names of all those, but elementary, you might recall
Watchdogs
some
or-
of those, yeah.
Yeah, they're like watchdogs is an
Yeah.
example.
And we are aware of those programs. I've not been a part of or led any deep conversation about that, but that certainly is something that we could continue to investigate. I know Pleasant Hill Elementary has, I think it's called Watchdogs, and the dog
Yeah,
stands for something.
Yeah, a couple dads on.
Dad's own car
Yeah.
or something like that.
Dad's a great student. We must have had a watchdog in there. Yeah, Dad's a great student.
Okay. Would you happen to have any data related to the increase in this part of the school year from August to December compared to previous school years for fights, expulsions, suspensions?
I would not have that data. I have to refer again to Mr. Caldwell and their student services.
Since 2006, I can go back and speak with certainty because that's when I started doing it. We have averaged about less than 2% of the population of students that are recommended for expulsion. My very first year, 2006, 2007 school year, again, that's 10, 15 years ago. So we were, a much smaller district at that time, probably 7,000, 8,000 smaller. We had a little over 400 expulsion hearings that year. Now that sounds exorbitant, and that's 400 too many, but it was just shy of 2% of the population. Interestingly enough, over all those years that I've been a part of tracking it, those percentages have remained constant. The number may go up, but as our enrollment goes up, but it's never been over a 2% of our total population recommended for expulsion. The last 3 years, the last 2 years, and then this year, the last 3 years, 1.6%, 1.2%, and then last year was an anomaly. We had 93 total. So that's like 0.3%, but that's not fair. You don't add that into the mix because we didn't have all of our kids on campus until the last semester, or the last 9 weeks, actually. I will tell you, so far this school year, we are trending a little bit higher than usual, than we would be halfway through the school year. I don't know what that means for the spring, if it goes up, if it goes down, if it stays the same, but again, we're at 28,000 students, so the raw number may go up. I'm interested to see how that plays out and what the percentage will be. But we are currently seeing an increase of hearings relative to this time of the year in previous years.
Okay. And thank you for that. So this, I guess, is for Dr. Little, maybe. After the White Knoll High School incident, the principal asked that the attendance phone call feature be turned on so that parents would be notified when there were absences. Why haven't we implemented that in the other schools?
I'm going to have, do you do the attendance stuff?
We do.
Yeah, go and kind of see where that landed there, because there were some reasons behind it.
The reason it
that
was turned
associated
off,
with different
and
codes.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, I'm sorry, no.
The reason it was turned off is when we were on COVID and we had COVID absences and COVID attendance codes, it became very confusing because we had students who were actually not in the building but marked present, some were marked absent, and parents were getting inundated with calls that weren't accurate. So the decision was made to turn that off. It has been turned back on at Mr. Daughtry's request. And we are preparing to turn that back on, if you will, the dialer for all the schools. And we've also decided that regardless of where COVID may take us in the future, that's probably a function that it's better to leave on and maybe cause a little bit of confusion than to not notify parents when the students actually aren't on campus. But last year was a really tremendously strange year for attendance because kids were virtually absent, they were virtually present. It got very, very convoluted. But we have
And
corrected
certainly the beginning of this year was the same
same
thing.
way, and yeah, That's right.
Okay. And Mr. Ellisor, I was actually writing the question down as this lady was asking it, because I'm a parent too, and I go into the schools. So that push-button camera at the door, what exactly is the purpose of that? Now, they might recognize me, they might not, I don't know. But I'm always, I mean, regardless of the school, I'm just buzzed right on in.
Sure. Most people probably recognize you, but that could be, and they recognize parents as well. They get accustomed to the parents coming in. It's a layered approach. It's simply a layer. It gives them the opportunity to see the person coming through the door, right? So but prior to this instance, I could take me back to White Knoll High School, and used to be parents were bringing in lunches at lunchtime. You'd have, I mean, there were probably 100, 200 people walking through that door back and forth, opening, closing, and people were being checked out. And I remember one time looking into an incident, and there were probably 25 people in this front office. How do you manage that as the person behind the desk trying to deal with all those people? That's the purpose of the system, is to give them the opportunity to see who's coming through that door and state their purpose in coming through that door.
And Ms. Garris, I'll just leave this information as well, is that there's more to that process than that one little camera that you see when you push that button.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay, so after the White Knoll event, I know a bunch of teachers said that they showed up at school and it was just a normal day. If there were extra counselors there, no one mentioned that to them. Same way with the students. Is there some kind of, I guess, counseling that they're offered afterwards?
You'll forgive me, but Mr. Pender has an hour drive.
Oh,
to
okay.
home.
Yeah, I looked
He lives in
around.
Sumter, so I gave him permission to leave, so let me fill that the best I can. And yes, we do have grief counselors. We do have a crisis response team that will respond, for example, to the tragedy that happened in Gilbert last week. I'm not exactly clear as to the response or lack of response, if that's what was perceived with the White Knoll situation. I do know that Mr. Pender was in contact with his guidance, or the guidance director.
School counselor, school counselor.
Did I say guidance?
You did.
The guidance director, school counselor director at the school. Well, I think it's called the guidance director, so. And it was decided at that time that, in her opinion, that they didn't need a full-blown crisis response that they would, say if they lost a student or something like that happened. So, but that is something that we have evaluated since then, and in line with our constant learning and growth. That's something we certainly would probably respond to differently.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask.
That's ridiculous. Are you scared, baby?
TikTok video got crisis response, but we couldn't.
Yes, baby, we're all scared. I get it, no matter how school, because he's scared. He don't trust his teachers because he thought it was a drill.
Okay. I would say really, I think our teachers need a little help. As far as enforcing discipline to begin with, but even after a situation like that, and I know you said that would be addressed, but I mean, I think I took my last call like 11-something the night following that, all day long. They just said there's no discipline in the schools, and they think that this is really what this goes back to. And I don't know, I'm talking to you, Mr. Caldwell, but I guess Dr. Little they really want discipline enforced. Kids aren't required to wear their IDs. They don't have any respect for authority. The kids tell them basically, we can do whatever we want. And they complain about bullying. But those situations, I guess, need to be handled. The bully needs to be disciplined and the victim needs to be offered counseling. And I feel like if you provide those avenues, then they will come. But basically just, talk to the people in schools, the teachers, the instructional assistants. They all really struggled with the White Knoll incident, and I know we've had a lot of this just in other schools, threats, weapons, since that time, not to that magnitude. But just, I guess to quote one teacher here, teachers have to have somewhere to go. There is no discipline in school, and we have no recourse. We have the same education as those at the top, but we're treated like all we can do is teach. Who do we go to when we write kids up, but all they get is a conference? I can give a conference as a consequence. When I show up in an administrator's office, I need them to do something. I don't have the power to do anything. And I know as a bus driver, we felt that way as well. You can write them up, but you can't make anybody do anything once you write them up. So I would just ask that there's some conversations in the schools about what we can do going forward, because I didn't see any of that mentioned, earlier.
The interesting dichotomy to that is, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, because if that's their perception, then that is their reality. But I frame that under the context of what I said earlier, that our expulsion hearings are higher than they've ever been at this point. Now, that's not a point of pride, and we're not bragging, but so there's this disconnect somewhere, because students are creating situations and making decisions that are landing them in our office at a rate unseen in my time that I've been doing this. And at the same time, I'm hearing that there is no discipline in the school, so that we certainly need to continue to address that. And I think this is a supposition on my part, but maybe it's the minor things that are being overlooked or not handled to someone's opinion appropriately enough. Maybe those things are going, and sometimes we major in the minors, and those small things become a greater issue, collectively. It's not an individual student who's late to class. It's the 15th time he's been late to class. Now, I'm making this up, but it's as if we have this dual modality, so to speak, that we're expelling or recommending students for expulsion at a much faster rate than we were in the past, yet we're hearing that there's no discipline in the schools. So we need to continue to have conversations. We had conversations with all of our principals just yesterday about these very topics. Well, let me take that back, with our middle and high school principals just yesterday about this. So
And I'll add to that, Mr. Daltrey did focus groups throughout his entire building, students and staff, as part of that as well. So we have a lot of good information regarding that.
Okay. Yeah, I would just encourage you to have conversations with teachers, staff, instructional assistants as well, because I think they got a lot to say. And I think they would welcome the opportunity to be heard. No, I guess I can address some of this later. I hate to go on and on and on, but I do have a few more questions, but I can hold off on these.
I guess, this is a terrible head and heart spot for students, for teachers, staff, parents, grandparents, everybody sitting up here, your team, Mr. Ellisor, to think about somebody coming into our schools and doing harm to our children. It's just a terrible head and heart spot to be in. I don't know if the weight that is felt is truly conveyed, but it is heavy. And so, I think we would be remiss if we didn't identify who the heroes are in this story, and that's the students. They felt a comfort in the culture that they were around to bring forth concerns and to bring forth fears, and fared it out to be true. So, that's a hero in my book. And I think that speaks to all the things that we're talking about. I think that speaks to the discipline. I think that speaks to the social and emotional learning aspect. I think that speaks to everything Mr. Pender spoke about, that the culture is set as a protective culture. Also, we don't know what we don't know. And so, from what I gather and from what I understand, we welcome SLED to come into our schools and tell us what we don't know. We welcome the identifiers of, you need cameras. You need cameras in this location. You need to up this. You may need additional security. I don't think there's any recommendation they would make that we would not give every weight and consideration to, and every budgetary allowance that we can. You know, that's the hard part of our position, is that if you notice over the past 3, 4, or 5 years, everything is cyclical and everything has priority at any given time. When I first came on the board, school safety was a high priority. Unfortunately, we sometimes treat school safety, and I don't mean this board, I mean as a culture, we treat school safety as a one-time event. And it's not a one-time event. It is a conversation to be had. It's a conversation that is continued with the students, that is continued with the staff, and we make and course correct and adjust all along the way. And so to me, our process starts there. Our process starts with SLED. Our process starts with evaluating our schools to give us the slate in which we need to operate from, so that we can make the best informed decisions. I don't know what the solutions are. I know some questions I have, but I don't know what the solutions are, and I think we have to appreciate that. I think we have to appreciate the advice that you and your staff give. I did not send my children the next day, okay, because I know of the culture that exists in our schools, and I know the work that goes on behind the scenes, and so I feel secure in that. And but you know, are we flawless? No, we're not flawless, but we have to have a conversation about it, and I think it starts with SLED. So I was glad to see that.
Dr. Little, so when I'm looking around this room, there's about maybe 5 people that I don't know, but the rest, whether it's senior leadership or the board, we are all parents. And so I know all of us in here really, truly, our kids' safety is super important to us. And so maybe you or even Catherine could elaborate a little bit on how you guys decide what information you do share with parents when there is a threat. For example, I know there's lockdowns and lockouts. Lockouts are the threats outside the school, lockdowns the threats inside the school. So for example, just in the past week, we've had a lockdown at a school and a lockout at a school. And when there was a lockout, the parents were shared, because it was at my own kid's school, what the threat was. We were told the person had escaped, they were in this area, the police were looking for them. We were given information, and it's sounding, I'm not a parent at Wayne, so I don't know exactly what they were told, but it sounds like they were just told, hey, there's a lockdown. So how did you guys, is that what was shared? That was the quote that I heard earlier.
Well, here's what I want to do. Instead of, it's not really Catherine. Catherine is the mode of the
yeah.
sharing, right?
Yeah.
So notice that the text messaging is actually something new for us, I think maybe last year or so in terms of communication.
So really more like how you guys decide what information you're sharing.
So I'm going to let Mr. Ellisor talk about that, because it's about our law enforcement. It's about
right.
us
so I just
and communication.
I think it would be helpful for us to hear why you share what you share.
I think it when you're in an active situation and you're working with law enforcement, we take guidance from law enforcement about what they're doing, where they're going, what they're investigating, and how they're investigating it. And we don't want to do anything to jeopardize an investigation. So we have to be very careful not to share too much information. So we take guidance and direction from law enforcement in those situations. And I mean, you mentioned we're parents. He's a parent. He wanted to put his kids' pictures up there, and I told him don't do it. We're all parents, and we all understand the angst and the anxiety about the situations. I'm standing there last week, and we had a locked out situation. I'm standing there with the law enforcement officer listening to their radio, and I have angst, and I've got the information coming right to me, so I understand the need for consumption of information. And at some point, you have to you have to understand that those involved in the situation are working as hard and as fast as they can to get more information to folks that doesn't impact what's happening.
So it's safe to probably tell our parents that we will share every bit of information that is safe to share with you based off of what the law
Christy,
enforcement
do you have any
experts
other-
are telling
No,
us.
that pretty much sums it up, and we work with all law enforcement partners, and, you know, who's sending the communication? I mean, is the principal sending the communication? Is the principal communicating with me to find out that information? You know, so you gotta think about those steps in place. Is the administration communicating with Catherine's office, the communications department, before sending that information? You know, that's kind of where that is, but we don't want to get ahead of law enforcement. We work with them. They are kind enough to contact folks like me to say, hey, this is what's going on. You need to be aware of it. You need to lock out your schools, things like that. It is a relationship that we have formed over the years, and we don't want to jeopardize that relationship by giving out information that we're not supposed to know, but we're going to do everything we can to protect our students and our schools.
I think we're just, y'all, in such a hard time because
With this-
everyone
That's
has
exactly
these
right.
in their back pocket. And so, I mean, I would be willing to say majority of our secondary students have these at their fingertips, which means my kids can text mama and say, hey, we're locked down, what's going on? And then I'm thinking, oh no, I don't know. But,
That sums it up right there. That's exactly what's happening. Yes.
so,
And so everything's happening so quickly, and everybody's wanting answers so quickly, we can't give them answers because law enforcement is the one who's working that incident, not us. So we're just trying to manage what's
which
happening.
doesn't make us feel any better, but
I understand.
yeah.
I understand.
May I also add that it is very fluid in a situation like this, and it's happening very fast. And I do think the lockout that happened in the River Bluff area is a good example.
Oh,
of
yeah.
Police told me what was happening and said, you can send this, and I sent it, and not 1 minute later, they called me and said, that's not exactly what's happened. And so this is now what we know. And so if I shared what I did with White Knoll families, what if it had changed in 1 minute and now families of 2,000 students had the wrong information? You know, so I also try to be a calming presence in sharing as much reliable, factual information as law enforcement allows me to share when I can share it. And in the text that I sent, I also said, I will share another message when I can. And I tried to then do that with families when I could safely do that. But I also want to remind parents that our immediate goal is to make sure their student is safe inside the building. That's always going to be our first goal. And then communicating and allowing them to know what's happening with their student is a very close second goal, but making sure their student is safe inside the building is our first goal.
Well, and Ms. McPhail, I'll add to just the conversation, I mean, and not to go into how law enforcement makes decisions, but I think, you know, like we've talked about, a lockout is that there is a danger outside of the school, and a lockdown is the danger is inside the school. And it could be that sharing more information quickly about what's going on with a lockdown would make the students inside the building less safe. And so if there was not more information shared, then that is law enforcement's way of keeping those students in the building safer until they can share more information. Does that kind of make sense? Because with the lockout, the information was happening on the outside, and the students, as long as they stayed in the building, they were fine. But with the lockdown, when the students are in the building, we wanted to make sure that they were safe. And so the best way to do that was not more information, because what was happening was inside the building with them, so.
And one other question. Clear bags and metal detectors, what has been the conversation around those?
There was a conversation in years past related to athletics about those. Several in the state started looking at that after I think it was the Irmo incident at a football game where an individual yelled gun. There was no gun, but there was something on those lines which prompted that conversation. But we have had that conversation, yes.
And what did that entail?
We don't have clear bag policies or metal detectors at athletic fields, so we're still in those talks currently. As I understand, we're going to reevaluate that to take another look at it.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk about our investment in armed officers at those games?
Yeah, so when we had those conversations, one of the things that came up was the logistics of managing metal detectors, as an example. If you take, and we talked through this the other day, if you take Lexington High School, for example, in the spring, you're familiar with the campus. You have a softball field on one side of the campus, you have tennis courts, then you have a baseball field, then you have a track, and then you have a soccer or football stadium, which could be being used for lacrosse. You have acres of events that could be going on at one time. So funneling parents to those various events and manning, 6 to 8 metal detectors that would probably be required to handle that became challenging for the school to staff and challenging for us to try to figure out how to staff as well. And so the conversation led to what's more effective, or the most effective thing, is to see an armed law enforcement presence at these events. And so we focused at the time our resources on providing that. And if you go back and look in the budget, in years past, schools were, out of their local fundraising budgets, booster club budgets and so forth, were staffing resource officers at games inconsistently, because some schools didn't have the fundraising capability to support the staffing. And the hourly wages required to support these resource officers will continue to go up. So the district took that on, said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to fund that centrally, and we're going to manage the scheduling of that. And so we removed that cost from the schools so that wasn't a barrier anymore. And so we put a focus on having armed officer presences at our events. We still have a struggle occasionally getting those staffed in the current environment. The police force has employment issues just like every other industry, it seems like. And so sometimes we can't get an armed officer available, but that's where we focused our resources right now. But we are having conversations. You're probably aware that there's been some legislation introduced to put walk-through metal detectors in every school in the state. And so we're evaluating that. Technology continues to get better. There is detection equipment out there now that you can just walk through, and it doesn't slow down the process. And so, we're obviously evaluating that as well. So it's a continuous process we're looking at.
All right, I think you have just the operations update, but we're going to take a quick 2-minute break.
Thank you all.